Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Great Ideas of Politics and Ethics. Today, we're talking about John Stuart Mill and specifically about his book On Liberty, um, which is one of my favorite books to discuss and one of my favorite books ever because it carries so many implications for contemporary society, specifically for America, but to what people usually call Western civilization, right? Liberal democracies, let's put it like that. Um, this book was fundamental, and we're going to talk about the book in a second, but um, it's usually typical to understand a little bit about the lives of the people who wrote the books. Not always, right? But it usually helps. And with John Stuart Mill and this book in particular, it helps a lot. So this is the one lecture here that I wanted to talk about. That I want to talk about the person. Because that explains, I think, a little bit. Well, you understand where he's coming from, and that helps understand a little bit where he ended up, right? In on Liberty, where those ideas came from. I think they came partially, not exclusively, and I don't want to exaggerate this point, but I do think they come partially from his biography itself, the way he grew up. Um, so John Stuart Mill is son of James Stuart Mill, and his father was. We're going to talk about him a little bit later as well. But his father was also an intellectual um, and one of the founding fathers of utilitarianism, which is a branch in philosophy of which Stuart Mill would be. A prominent figure right later due to the influence of his father. And his father was, of course, training him since a little baby, and that's where we start here, to become this great utilitarian philosopher that would bring forth his own ideas, right? Um, so the Stuart Mill's father told Stuart Mill's mother that until he was 3 years old, he was born in London, right? He was the eldest of nine children. So if you remember this from high school, you must have learned this at some point, or somewhere. Maybe someone told you this, that typically what happened back in the days was that the eldest son would receive all of so say the family isn't particularly wealthy, they will invest the money they have on the education of the eldest son, focus on the eldest son, hoping that person will turn out a physician or whatever, right? A public office, work on a public office, or just become someone important in society, and then the eldest son will become rich and then be able to help back, right, all of the other kid brothers and even the parents themselves. So typically, parents would invest money and effort and their time in the education, right, of the eldest of them. And in this case, it was John Stuart Mill. So basically, his father told his mother that until he was three, right, he was just too young, so he didn't care much about the baby, right? He was had a pretty cold and distant relationship, father to son relationship. You'll see that in the next slide, what happens. But his parent really treated him with, this sort of very extremely high expectations and very mechanically and robotically, right? So he basically says, well, until he's three, he can't really start learning to read or anything. So I don't care about the boy. Like, we'll do whatever you want with the boy. Basically, keep it like with you and do whatever you want. But then by the age he's three, um, then he's supposed to be in my office with me every day studying, and that's when his formal education will start, right? So bring me the kid when he's three, more or less. That's what he said to the mother, right? Um, it sounds pretty horrible, but that's kind of how their relationship went back there. A very patriarchal and sexist, right, society. And Stuart Mill would he will recount that later when he's older, that he always felt a little bit upset with his father because his father transformed him in this great intellectual, but at the same time, his father was very distant from his mother, right? They didn't have any, so the intellectual exchanges that they would have, Stuart Mill with his father, right? He wasn't capable of having those intellectual exchanges with his mother. It's just a matter of class gender as it was 200 years ago, right? Um, and so, in a way, he says, well, I couldn't have with my mom the relationship that I should have had. And he blames a little bit his father for this, right? I guess his father could have, I don't know, maybe engaged, like exchange with his mother and with the same way he did with his son, I guess, right? I mean, that's probably what he's coming from here and thinking. But either way, there's this asymmetry in the relationship that bothered him, that he realizes later on in his life. But be it as it may, when he was 3 years old, he started studying Greek and arithmetic. And impressively, at age 6.5, he writes the history of Rome. Not a 2-page essay or 5-page essay, right? But a complete history in the sense, complete. You cannot, right? Nothing is complete in the sense that it has everything. There's everything is in it, but a complete history in the sense that it had footnotes. It was a massive book, an actual work of a scholar, right? Which is crazy when you think he's 6 years old. But let me explain this to you. Stuart Mill is among the greatest geniuses of all times, and his IQ is said to be around 180, which, if you don't know how the scales go, that's roughly the same as Leonardo da Vinci, and not that different from Isaac Newton, which would be 190 or so. Obviously, these measures are not super precise, but that's the estimation, right, that you have of the greatest intellect. So if you look at the greatest geniuses of all time, they're going to score around 180 to 200, okay, like the super geniuses, okay. So he is in that. If you look at just if for curiosity, go and Google IQ list of geniuses, you'll probably find Stuart Mill there among the 20 or 30 names, right? Then you'll see. Um, of course, there's a billion geniuses that never become famous, I assume, right? As some will eventually have mental problems or whatever. Um, and then, or there's a Brazilian guy actually that he's in a band, and his IQ is super high. And his music is pretty silly. Like there are people with really high IQ like that, 180, and they don't really want to be scientists or anything like that. So that guy is it would be the equivalent of Green Day in the United States. You know what I'm saying? It's pop punk rock, and the music is like about summer and going to the beach and having fun. And the guy is very shallow, like a normal person. You would never say, you see his interviews, you'd never say that he has a super high IQ. He's very normal. He seems very, like very mundane, like he's not an intellectual or anything like that. But he does have this IQ, super high IQ. So I mean, top 20 among famous people, right? So that's what I'm saying. Of course, there's millions of, I guess there's been thousands and thousands of geniuses that never, right, became famous or never wanted to become intellectuals or turn out musicians or something else, and we don't even know about them. All right. Okay, so moving on. See, continues to grow up here. Okay, let's get a sip of water. All right, so by the age of 9, keep in mind that he starts learning Greek when he was 3, right? And by the age of 9, he was already fluent in Latin as well. He was learning both languages, right? The classical languages. That's what you would do in the 19th century. Such that when he was 10, he was reading Plato like you guys, but in Greek, right? Not in English. Um, And the whole book, you guys are lucky enough that you just read book one and book two. He read 10 books, right? I mean, he read all of Plato, really, like all the dialogues. But I mean, who we're not going to compare ourselves with Stuart Mill, right? He's 180 IQ, I mentioned. And also, you'll see that not everything is great about living this kind of life. That's what I'm going to say here. I mean, I'm not sure. Would you want to have lived this kind of life? Because it would be great, right? To know languages and know mathematics. Started learning arithmetics when he was 3. So between the ages 12 and 14, he amassed all of the literature in economics and logic that was available at the time, of course. Nowadays, the literature is 100 times, 1,000 times more than, right? I mean, we publish hundreds of thousands of articles every year now, and there's thousands of journals, academic journals. Obviously, back then, economics was much smaller. You had Adam Smith, several, you had still several, authors, but it's not like today. But still, a normal person is not able to do that, right? Even in the 19th century, I'm sure I wouldn't have been able to do that even in the 19th century. Um, and people said, I think this is very funny, that when he was 16 years old, he was 16 years ahead of anyone else, right? Which is probably true. Like, in other words, when he was 16, he could compete with people who were 32, right? Years, like at least, and probably more. I mean, he probably no one could, almost no one could, because frankly, who was able to become fluent in Latin and Greek and to read Plato and learn economics and logic in a lifetime, right? It's not many people. Okay, it's true that back then many people learned Greek, Latin, like I mentioned, but um, you know, I mean, he was probably. This is a nice way to explain it. I like it, right? That when he was 16, he was 16 years ahead, but actually he was more than that, probably, right? But when he was 16, he achieved what most people cannot achieve in a lifetime, really. But that's just Stuart Mill, and that there are consequences for that. Okay, because when he turned 20, guess what happened? I mean, if I'm just giving you a second to think about this, if you go through all of this very, very strict education, what could go wrong? Well, Stuart Mill has a mental breakdown and he goes through severe depression, and it's pretty tough. But eventually he does overcome it. He also, it's funny because he gets, I find this very ironic, but he has a mental breakdown and goes through severe depression for 6 months precisely because of so much pressure that his father has put on his shoulder all of his life, forcing him to study no stop and learn all of this stuff, right? And then what is the solution? What does he think? Like, how do I get out of this? I'll read more. That's what I find so funny. He gets out of, he walks his way out of depression and out of this mental collapse, mental breakdown that he had by reading, but by reading completely different stuff, to his credit. So he said, okay, let me stop doing all of the philosophy and economics, right? I don't want to study logic. I don't want to study none of that stuff. Ethics, philosophy, no. Let me read, poetry and novels, right? So he started, reading about the lives of ordinary people, romances, stories, just normal stuff. Um, Reading books that could speak to his heart rather than his mind. That's what he consciously tried doing. Also, he read all his life. There's nothing else he knew how to do, right? It's not like he could at 20 say, okay, I'm going to start socializing and going to parties and meet people. No, he never. He was a very awkward kid. Everyone who met him mentioned how remarkably smart he was, but also how awkward, right? He was in terms of he's not a person who played sports or went dancing or anything. He wasn't the best in terms of coordination or just small talk and social skills, soft skills like that, right? He was a pretty strange person. But then he fell in love, he had a relationship which endure for many years, and that changed him a lot. Both the relationship that he would eventually, the girl he eventually met, which influenced him a lot throughout his life. He would become a feminist. He would become a supporter of universal suffrage. So women could not vote back then, and he started to defend, influenced by this partner of his. He learned from her, right? I mean, he's understanding that why is it that women shouldn't vote? They should, right? So he was very um ahead of his time. He was also against slavery. That's pretty clear on Liberty. That's stated there clear. Um, he's against slavery, of course, like John Locke before him. But here's where I wanted to get. Why is it that I start with this biography of his? Because basically, there's one way that this is my interpretation. Okay, it's not a very standard one or anything, but I just want you to think about it like this. Metaphorically speaking, you can think about Stuart Mill's father as being the authoritarian state, right? And Stuart Mill being the individual. Okay, in the sense that in the book on liberty, he's going to try to explain what is it that the state can and cannot do, right? The most important thing for him is liberty and freedom. But sometimes the government may be allowed to do certain things, he'll argue, right? When is it that just in very, very few circumstances, right? So he wants a very small state that just do the minimal things, right? To preserve order in society. In a way, this reaction of his is also him realizing what happened to him. That's the way I see it, at least, right? That he was so pressured. He never made any choice. Think about it like that. Until he was 20, everything was imposed by him, by a central authority. That would be analogous to living in under Stalin, or North Korea or something like that. Living with a dictator or living with a central authority that decides everything for you, and yet you have no liberty, right? Stuart Mill lived like that, right? To some extent, when we grow up, we don't have a lot of freedom, right? Our parents tell us what we can and can't do, and we go to school and our teachers as well. But with Stuart Mill, you can see that it's worse than most of us, I guess. Hopefully, none of you went through this kind of life. But I mean, it was very intense. He was studying all day with his father in the office, and he didn't go to school. He didn't socialize with anyone. It was tough. He was studying a lot. I mean, again, at 6, he wrote a history of Rome with footnotes. Okay, so he read, he did it, he spoke Greek by then. So there was a lot of working here involved by a young kid. So no choices were made, right? And what's the consequence of that? Mental collapse. So I think Stuart Mill realizes how an individual needs to have her space to make her choices, right? Some level of freedom, or as much freedom as possible, really. Because Mill realized that he could have never recovered from that mental collapse. What if he remained depressed for the rest of his life or whatever, right? Or worse. He realized like that the lack of freedom nearly led him to his destruction, right? And and so I think the stance he takes on liberty is very similar to. He's very careful about how the consequences of state coercion upon an individual, because he saw the coercion of his father on him and what happened. So I think you can use that metaphor. That's my reading of it, but that must have played a role for him, right? As a person, if you imagine you lived this kind of life, you would probably be very skeptical of anyone else telling you what to do, right? After you're 20 and you had your depression and you recovered and now you're fine and you're recreating your own life and meaning in your own identity, and that's when he writes on this book on liberty, right? I mean, after that, but as he figured out his adult version of himself, right? The version he chose, right? Not that one that his father chose for him. Um, he must be reflecting on this, right? On the consequences of this external pressure. All right. So here you see his father and Jeremy Bentham, which was his godfather. And these two scholars were the founders, the founding fathers of utilitarianism, which is this theory that basically argues that in order to, so it's an ethical theory, a moral theory, okay? It's a theory of morality, in other words, of what is right or wrong. Should we do this? Should we implement policy A, for example? Should we prohibit alcohol? Something random, right? Just any policy you can think of. Should we prohibit this? Should we prohibit that? Right? Should we, or perhaps if you're too scared because I said, should we prohibit alcohol? And you're like, no, don't do that. So maybe we should just ask, should we prohibit drinking and driving? Now you're like, okay, that seems a bit too much because that's dangerous for innocent people, right? But either way, asking all of these questions, should or shouldn't we, right? We need a criterion to answer yes or no. And utilitarianism is an attempt to answer to those questions, a general attempt, right? It's a theory that says, well, in order to answer this question, basically what we should do is look at the collective happiness of like, if we can sum up the happiness of everyone, say a policy, should we prohibit alcohol? Okay, for example, the policy I gave. If 99.9% of America drinks alcohol, and that's not true. But if there's a small minority that doesn't drink alcohol and a very big majority that does, just for the sake of argument, right? Then prohibiting it will make a lot of people unhappy versus a few people happy, right? The very few that don't drink in this random example. So it wouldn't be a good policy. In other words, you can add up as if it were a mathematical calculus of adding happiness plus unhappiness, right? You ask every citizen, how happy or how unhappy would this policy make you, right? You can go from 0 to 10, plus 10 if it makes you happy, and from 0 to minus 10 if it makes you unhappy, and you give a score. Okay, so with the alcohol policy, everyone's saying, oh, +5, +7, right? +1. Maybe you never ever drink alcohol, but sometimes, just sometimes you do if there's a wedding. So you say +1. I mean, sometimes I would like alcohol once a year or whatever, right? But most people would give a plus something, and then very few people would just give a -5 or a -7 because they think alcohol is wrong, or because the religion perhaps prohibit alcohol, so they think it's morally wrong, etc. Right? Or because alcohol could lead to problems, which it could for other people, right? For instance, drinking and driving and stuff like that. But the point is, if you could add up all of these values, right? So you go +1, +9, +7, +6, you add up the pluses of all of the hundreds of people who said they would be happy, right? And then you discount -3, -4 of the few people that said they wouldn't want that policy. You would end up with a positive value, right? You would be making more people happy than unhappy, right? Not just more individuals happy, but more, if you could count how happy, that's why I'm using this scale from 0 to 10, right? You wouldn't just ask people, are you happy or unhappy? And then count if there's more of one or the other, but you would try to estimate and calculate the amount of happiness, amount of unhappiness that's bringing. You see the point here? So that's what these guys were thinking about. Let's try to make moral philosophy, ethics, as scientific as possible, right? If we could create a calculus of happiness and unhappiness, where we can sum up, right, the aggregate values of everyone, and then that should be the moral criteria. Okay, so it's very different from Socrates and Plato, right? They're thinking about the good life and ethics in terms of justice, the virtues, right? To be brave, to speak the truth, blah blah blah. All of those criteria that you can think about in terms of virtue. That's the kind of thing they were thinking about in Greece, right? With Aristotle and Plato and Socrates. Here they're being more kind of consequentialist in a sense, right? If you can look at the outcomes and how that would impact each person. So in a sense, we wouldn't need to look morally at something in principle, but look at what people think about it collectively. You see, it's there is nothing that is inherently good. It's what people make of it, in other words, right? So that's the idea of utilitarianism, which Stuart Mill right, son of James, that's what we're looking at, would also be part of, but no, we're not going to look at his book Utilitarianism, but he's part of this, right? And in a way, his On Liberty relates to this as well. All right, so here's my version of the book. As usual, you can use any version, but this is the one I use. It's edited by Elizabeth Rappaport. In case you want a high quality translation, or I mean, not translation. Sorry, obviously he's a British, but a high quality version of the book I made. Right, it's because there's, as usual, introductions and some explanations, footnotes, some additional stuff that it's edited by Rappaport. That's why it's a good, it's a quality version of the book. Okay, so Mill explains that the topic of the essay is civil or social liberty, the nature and limits of the power which can be legitimately exercised by society over the individual, right? That's what he's trying to, where do we draw the line? What are the limits of power, right? In other words, he's not saying we shouldn't have a government, we should live in our anarchy. No, he wants liberty as much as possible, but he understands that anarchy is not going to guarantee much liberty, will it? Because if we're living in anarchy, then there's no property rights, there's no rules at all, right? At least, well, there might be rules, but the rules are going to be imposed by whoever's the most powerful person in the group, right? It becomes tribal war usually if it's anarchy. At least that's what Mill thinks. So it's going to say, no, we do need a government, but it should be probably as small as possible. And what are the limits, right? Where do we draw the line? What can and can't the government do? Okay. And so here, let's contrast two visions of liberty, all right, which more or less correspond, not exactly, but more or less represent, if you want, Republican and Democrat parties. Two visions of the state should be quite small versus the state should be a bit bigger and should be more involved in, say, redistribution policies or healthcare for all, etc. Right? Those are the defining character differences between Republican and Democrats, a bit the size of the state and level of taxes, etc. Usually, those are at least up to now, right? Maybe in the near future, the narratives of both parties may change, but so far, that's more or less how the discussions go, right? So let's contrast these two sort of visions of liberty, because Stuart Mill basically is going to endorse this first vision here, liberty number one. Okay, next slide will be liberty number two, just so you understand. But liberty number one, the first definition of liberty is that, or in the sense, the definition of what's the role of the state, right, is that the government should only interfere to prevent one from causing harm to others. This is called the harm principle. Okay, Stuart Mill doesn't use that expression, the harm principle, but that's how everyone calls it. And it's a good way to, it's a nice way to summarize this, right? The harm principle. It's the principle that, although Mill doesn't use it, it's a nice one because it's the principle that the government should do as little as possible, right? It only should interfere when, again, the drinking thing. So you are allowed to drink. If you're just getting drunk at your home and only harming yourself, that's fine, Stuart Mill will say. But if you start driving around and harm other people, then in order to prevent a drunk person, okay, or a drunk person with a gun or whatever it is, then the government has the moral right to interfere, right? That makes a lot of sense, I guess, right? I mean, if someone is drunk or drugged and has a gun pointing at you and the police, right, stops that person from killing you, you'll be pretty happy that the government interfered with liberty, right? Because that is a restriction of liberty. That's what you have to understand. Everything is a restriction of liberty, right? But some of them, I mean, the police, every time the police uses force, that's a restriction of someone's liberty. But sometimes you need to reduce liberty to get freedom, okay? In order for you to be free in the sense that, you're never completely free, but we're restricting the liberty of being drunk and driving or being drunk with a gun, right? But you're doing that in order to guarantee freedom to people, to other people, because if we don't restrict that liberty, then you wouldn't feel free, right? If you're walking around and everyone is drunk with guns, you wouldn't feel comfortable or free at all, right? So you restrict liberty to get freedom. That's the idea here. Um, and that's a very limited scope for government for sure, and that's what still that Stuart Mill will endorse. That's the only situations where it should interfere. Okay, this is typically associated with, not exactly, but there are different labels that mean different things. But classical liberalism, conservatives, libertarianism, you must have heard those expressions. They will, of course, they are different. Classical liberalism versus libertarianism. Classical liberalism will understand a bigger role for the government. So classical liberals admit of more state intervention relative to libertarians, right? But so they are different, of course. But overall, and what I was saying, that if you want to think about the Republican Party, more or less, okay, um, follows this broader definition of um, so this definition, liberty one, the government, the harm principle. Okay, let's see liberty number two to contrast. So the second would be not only, okay, from you, that the government should not only prevent you from harming other people, but also prevent you from harming yourself, right? So drug abuse or people you're getting drunk at your own house, that's horrible for you if you're doing that all day, right? But you're not necessarily damaging society. Let's assume you aren't. Maybe you are, because if you're not working and you're not paying taxes, and if the government is paying, if there's some subsidy, if somehow, I mean, in a sense, when you're not doing nothing, you already are. You could argue you are harming society because you're not contributing, right? If you were a productive person and you were working and producing, that would be better for everyone else. So that's what I'm trying to point out. But you're not like physically harming anyone, right? It's not a direct, because here harm is not. Okay, we're gonna get there. Let me not jump over the gun. But the second version, okay, is this idea that sometimes it's called paternalism, and then is more similar to the Democrat version, the Democratic Party. I'm not saying they're paternalistic or anything like that, but comparing, right, just to have a sort of benchmark, right? If we're thinking about these two versions, the version one sounds a little bit more like the Republican Party, while the second version sounds a little bit more like the Democrat Party, right? I think we can all agree that. I'm not saying it's a perfect definition of what these parties are, but they more or less represent. And Mill's going to discuss these versions, and essentially, as I mentioned, he's going to stick to the first one, right? Say, okay, I'm defending the first one. I'm not going to look at paternal. I mean, he thinks that's a little bit too much, right? So he would argue that the government should not prevent you from drug abuse as long as you're not harming anyone else, right? That's the the line, the threshold. The threshold is when you start harming someone else, then that's not okay. But as long as you're keeping it to yourself, do whatever you want. Okay. So let's focus, however, for the rest of the class here only on vision one. Since again, as I mentioned, right, that's what Mill's going to defend. We're going to see Karl Marx for the last lecture of the course, in two lectures, and that's going to be the extreme version of paternalism, right? So we don't need to talk about that right now. Also, especially because Mill, is not defending, he's not advocating for that. All right. So what he's going to argue, which is interesting, and that's a mistake. I think that sometimes I see libertarians going and exaggerating a bit, going all the way to anarchy, right? Kind of argue, oh, governments are always bad. This sort of binary vision of life, 0 or 1, good or bad, right? Good or evil. And among libertarian circles, you would sometimes hear people who exaggerate too much, exaggerate this argument by going all the way, going all in, as it were, right? Government's always bad. Government shouldn't be doing anything. And Mill clearly saying at the end of the day, the government is always going to have to exercise power. I mean, let's just look at this for a second, this argument, right? Because you see this a lot. People always criticizing anything that the government does in principle without even thinking about what it is that the government will do. Okay. We have these sort of identity politics and people taking these very extreme views of what government should or shouldn't do. So the other, it's also true that people will make the opposite mistake as well, right? Likewise, meaning that government, whatever they do is always good and they always justify in interfering, right? So there's a bunch of people who are um, on both sides. That's what I'm saying. That will argue, oh, like in ex ante, like before you even you see a news article or it's on Twitter and there's something about government, and then people will criticize without even reading what it is that the government did, or vice versa, right? People saying yes, or people saying yeah, governments need to be super active because markets are always wrong. So these are the two visions. Markets are always right and governments are always wrong, and vice versa, right? And Mill's saying, no, I mean, government, like the example I gave, I think is with the gun, right? If you argue that government is always bad, then you actually don't even have capitalism really, because without the government, it's the government that institutes the police power, and it's the police that establishes property right? In order for you to have a company, have a business, and make profits, you need property rights. You need to be sure that people are not going to start invading and stealing your equipment, your money, your technology, and even you, right? In the sense that they will kidnap you or whatever, right? That's what I was mentioning at the beginning of the lecture. If you go all the way to anarchy, then it becomes tribal wars, right? Whoever has the better guns and whoever's stronger and whoever gathers the biggest tribe with more guns is going to start dominating one another, right? It stops being capitalism and economics and market and a market economy and a commercial society. It stops being all of that if you don't have property rights, if you don't have law legislation, if you don't have the police power. That's the government, right? At its minimum. Obviously, the government can go all the way from this small government that only guarantees law and order and only guarantees the social contract, right? Like Hobbes and Rousseau and Locke. You need the government to guarantee the social contract. Otherwise, it's a war of all against all, right? We are a wolf to one another. Hobbes is the story. So, I mean, um, so, he's going to argue that Mill was going to explain. I think that's very interesting at the beginning of the book, right? Especially he's discussing this in the first part of the book. That it's always an issue of legitimacy, right? When is it legitimate, okay, to restrict liberty? Okay, when is it and when is it not? So to contrast with Rousseau, you remember that Rousseau argued that the Savage's life was better than, right? Because as we progress, we end up becoming morons, kind of, right? Too vain and too greedy and too worried about what other people are wearing and too worried about whether someone else has an iPhone 15 and I have a iPhone 14, right? Rousseau's arguing all of that stuff, that the Savage life was better because, and you've never heard of a Savage that killed himself. Remember that story? So here to use that story, Mill is saying, well, if you want to kill yourself, that's fine. He doesn't have a problem with that, right? Just to explain this, again, the harm principle, right, is always that issue of harming others. So you have the liberty to do whatever you want. In other words, should the government prevent people from killing themselves? I think probably I don't know if most of us, I don't know. I wish we could discuss this. Right. But You can actually write it on the comments if you want. I never said that before, but if you want to write that on the comments just for fun, or send me an email, so I know your opinion. Should discuss this. I would love to know what you guys think. So, should the government prevent people from killing right themselves? Like, assume that there is an easy way that you can see that people are I don't know. I'm not going to the logistics of it, right? Because how do you know if a person is depressed enough that she's in a suicidal mood, et cetera, et cetera? But the whole question here is that's something that should people have the autonomy, right? Because what are the limits of individual liberty? And part of the argument for why your government might, I'm not going to say if it is or it isn't. You can tell me if you want. You can write here in the comments, as I said, or send me an email, whatever you want, telling me what you think about this. Just for curiosity, I'm obviously not going to evaluate your opinion here or anything, but I'd be curious to think because, well, again, Mill is going to say, right, this would be the same as a person who gets drunk at her house and doesn't go, right, doesn't go out, doesn't go driving, or doesn't go around with a gun shooting anyone. Would be analogous here. You're only harming yourself, so I don't see why the state should interfere. At the end of the day, Mill would argue, if you're depressed and if you want suicide, you made that decision for yourself. How do I know, right? Why should I tell you that you have to keep living, right? Like, that's what Milt's thinking. Like, if you came to that conclusion, right? Maybe from your perspective, it's not worth it, and I shouldn't interfere with that, right? That's the argument for why states shouldn't, or one of the arguments. You can think about this from so many angles. I guess that's why I'm curious what you think. But the other argument, okay, we're not going to look at it, but there's a nice article called Paternalism by Dworkin. And Dworkin is, I can share with you this as well if you want. But he's going to defend that the state should prevent, okay, people from killing themselves. And the reason is, according to him, is okay, maybe the person is depressed and the person has decided, right? It's her free will, and she understood like that's the best for her. But the point is that that's irreversible, right? I mean, you kill yourself and that's it. So in that case, when you have actions, individual behavior that have irreversible consequences, like suicide, okay, that's working. That's a different article, but I'm just making a counterpoint here to Stuart Mill, is going to argue then the government should actually interfere, right? If there's a case where we know that that person there is about to suicide, kill herself, the government should break into her house and take her to an hospital. Dworkin will argue, prevent her from killing herself, because if treated, that person will change her mind and will look back and say, "Oh my God, I can't believe I wanted to kill myself, and now I've overcome this." In other words, your behavior and your decision, it's always contextual, right? It depends on what you're living. So for decisions that are irreversible, maybe it makes more sense that the government be paternalistic, right? Because you might change your mind in the future. And so that's one of the arguments, okay, for why paternalism makes more sense in some circumstances. But okay, let's keep going. Okay, so it's genuine harm, not offense, not racial slur, right? For example, if a person burns the flag, that's offensive to many people, right? If you're a patriot or if you're nationalistic and you see I'm a migrant, right? I'm not from the US. So if you saw me, I would never burn the flag. I have much respect for the US, but I'm just giving you a hypothetical example. If we were in a classroom and I did that thing, which is horrible, you would feel offended, right? Oh, you're not even American. You don't understand what it means to be an American. What are you doing? Stuart Mill would say, that's fine. People can do that because you're not physically harming, right? You're not getting hurt physically. You're just getting hurt morally or psychologically, right? This is an offense, but not harm. He would say, it becomes an offense if you throw that flag on someone and then you actually burn that person. I use this example simply because here you can see how something can be very offensive, but not physically, right? It's not a genuine harm in the sense physically. Your skin is not burning, right? And then it goes, and then it becomes something that actually is genuine harm. But it's you see what the point is, right? Or racial slur, right? We would be very uncomfortable with that. Some people would be completely fine with banning. I mean, I don't know. Obviously, free speech is so big, right? But there are certain things that we cannot say, isn't it? Think about racial slur and other things. Prejudice, language that is racist, okay, or sexist, etc., right? Against any sort of minority, I guess. Think about that. So Stuart Mill again here would say that's offensive, right? But it's not genuine harm. Obviously, you can say, well, what is genuine harm? It becomes very complicated if you think about mental effects when you take into consideration mental health, right? Um, but here he's thinking just about physical, okay, physical harm. So racial slur wouldn't be a big deal, but you cannot scream at, on someone's ear to the extent that it actually hurts her ear. That's what you cannot do, right? It doesn't matter what you scream, as well you can is actually scream to the point that it hurts. If it hurt, like, right? I mean, exaggerating to make the point. I guess it's probably clear. All right. So feminists took issue with this because pornography fits into this definition. Okay. I mean, I think that should be quite clear here, but they're basically, Stuart Mill would say, what about pornography? He would say, and probably, he didn't say that in the book, but according to the harm to this, right, should government regulate pornography is what I'm saying. Mill, again, here would say no, right? Like the suicide example again. If someone is watching pornography, that's not harming someone else, he would say. So and of course, you can say, well, what about the people who are producing it, right? That are supplying the material, not the demand side, but the supply, right? That could be the meaning to women that are involved in the business, et cetera, et cetera. Sure, but he's just looking at people who are watching, right, pornography. Should government regulate that? And he's saying no, right? The freedom to liberty of people to watch it. Okay, that's what he's looking at here. Or I mean, that's what I'm talking about here. But it's just to give us some examples, right? But yeah, the overall, as I'm trying to explain, principle here in the book, idea in the book, there's three parts to this lecture, but this is part one. But the overall idea of the book is this idea of where you draw the line of the government line, right? Which regulations, which restrictions upon individual freedom are and aren't acceptable, right? And who gets to decide it, right? Because that the objection people have is also to any state intervention is who watches the watchman, right? If you have a watchman, meaning the state, the government regulating society, then who watches the watchman, right? How do we make sure that the government doesn't become corrupt or doesn't become inefficient and starts hiring people that aren't necessarily the best for the job, but are just their family or whatever. And all of these problems involved, possible problems involved with governments, right? They tend to be inefficient, and there's interest groups, et cetera, right? Who watches the watchmen? So who gets to decide, right? All right. What about social media? So just again, to use another example, social media, Mill would say the same. If you don't like social media, turn it off, like pornography or alcohol. If you don't like alcohol, I mean, you can get drunk and you can kill yourself, use drug abuse, etc., to the point that you kill yourself. That's up to you. If that's if you understand that that's not what you want, right? I mean, you're doing that because you want, he's saying, right? It's your liberty, like you pay the consequences. So if you chose it, it's up to you. If you don't like it, turn it off. He would basically say, you know better than anyone else what's good for you, right? He's going to argue why Stuart Mill, obviously there wasn't internet back then, right? I'm just applying his harm principle to contemporary issues. Because now we're talking about the issue of, is social media neutral? What if it shapes reality and perception of especially young kids. But you all are all still young. You're kind of adults now, but you're still young, right? But especially let's think about the next, the people who are actually like little kids. I guess you guys are already, you know, old enough that you probably um but still, I don't know. I mean, I don't use social media, so I honestly I'm asking these questions because I don't even use social media. I wouldn't know. I don't use it at all. None of them. So, is that possible? That's what I hear a lot, right? And I don't know the extent to which maybe that may vary a lot from person to person. But part of debates I see sometimes is that, say, on Instagram, a person will take 30 selfies and then only post the best one where you look prettier, right? So everyone is kind of looking for the best possible angle and using filters and using, I don't know, electronic makeup. I don't know if that exists. I don't use social media, but I mean, I've seen stuff on YouTube, right? People talking about this. So I mean, I thought it made sense what they were saying that basically, um, if all of us on social media are just showing our best sides, then everyone looks better than they actually are. That may lead you to look at other people and say, oh, they're also pretty, so successful, so rich. They're all right, like on a yacht. I don't know. I've heard, and maybe that's totally nonsense, but I've heard how sort of like people projecting themselves in the way that they aren't really in reality could cause other people to create. This is very much the Rousseau thing, right? So I don't even have to go into this. Remember everything we talked about Rousseau? Right, there you go. So Rousseau here, the crystallization of what Rousseau is talking about, the idea of us comparing it with one another. So it would potentialize even further all of the negative aspects of competition that Rousseau is arguing. Social media would, according to these critics, you know, make those effects even worse, right? Because I mean, now you can see the lives of famous people who have a lot of money, and you're going to see these realities that aren't our realities, probably. And so anyway, I mean, that's kind of the argument, right? Like Mill is basically saying, well, you don't like social media, turn it off. You're an individual, you have free will, right? Because Stuart Mill likes books, but he's not going to tell you you're stupid, you like Instagram, right? He's saying, I like book and you like Instagram, and that's fine. Why should I tell you that I'm better than you are? Because I like Plato and you like Instagram, right? Mill is I think that's very humble of his to say each person knows their own. I like my stuff, but I shouldn't impose my own preferences upon you, right? And tell you social media is useless. I think Stuart Mill is totally right in that sense. But what people say a little bit, right, is that it's possible that you've been using social media. I don't know, you grew up into it or you used it, and then it just completely shaped everything for you. I mean, it changed your behavior. You can, in other words, it's possible. Okay, I'm not saying that's the case, but that's what some people say. But it's possible that social media, and I guess social media is probably good and bad. There's probably great things on it and horrible things as well. I assume it has a little bit maybe of this effect, unless maybe you're very confident about yourself and you don't care about other people at all, etc. And maybe it doesn't, maybe you don't feel any of this thing that I'm talking about. So I'm sure this varies from person to person. But I'm assuming for most people, there's both things, right? There's probably things you see and days you feel like, and also like great things in it. I don't know. But the point here would be, of course, that do we, that the criticism, people would criticize Mill would say, is that true? Are we always in control of our actions, right? Is it possible that you go into social media and you get sort of gaslighted, as it were, right? What if it isn't neutral anymore, right? What if it affected your own sense of yourself, your preferences, your perceptions of reality to the extent that now you don't even have that free will anymore. You became sort of addicted to it, perhaps, or it became a necessity in your life. So maybe those choices aren't just like that. And maybe it could make sense to not regulate. I mean, I'm not gonna take an authoritarian strong position here. The government should prohibit, blah blah blah. But it might make sense that you have, I don't know, educational programs that the government tries to alert people of maybe some regulations that help people and just reflect upon the negative consequence. That's all I would say, right? Not prohibit anything, but it might make sense if it's true. If any of this makes sense, then it might make sense, I guess, right? That the government regulates in the sense that maybe has some educational campaigns. Maybe you're using Instagram and you could have like a thing that will pop there automatically and will tell you about the negative effects of Instagram. I'm not sure that would work at all. Probably would be so annoyed with that and just try to skip it. But I don't know. I don't have solutions for these problems. But and I'm not even saying they are necessarily problems, but I just want to make the counter argument to Mill here a little bit. Okay, what are other critiques? Number one, is it possible? Here is the two films. Forrest Gump, you probably know of it, and the other one is Castaway, where Mel Gibson. You know Robinson Crusoe, the book. So the film Castaway is inspired in the book Robinson Crusoe. He gets stranded in an island. Hmm. I already hinted at this critique earlier. I was, do purely self-regarding actions exist. So, for example, suicide or you getting drunk at your house. Well, if you have a family, right, there's going to have consequences for your family and your friends, right, and your colleagues or of your actions like that, right? They care about you. You affect people. That's the first thing. Unless you are in an island. That's why I have these pictures here, right? Um, but what's funny about Forrest Gump here too is that his whole point was to just run by himself and he's isolated to it. I mean, he's not always trying to be isolated, but he's just running, right? It's an individual action where he's not trying to have any effect, and yet you remember from the film that people start following him, right? In other words, there is this idea of it's hard to understand to what extent individual actions do not have effects on it and on other people. It might be that every action does have an effect, and if that's the case, then it gets a bit it muddles the waters, right? Because Mel's saying, well, as long as it doesn't affect anyone else, and well, he's saying harm, so obviously that's more demanding, right? But I'm just saying here if we use harm as a little because nowadays we're not going to use that very restricted definition of physical harm, right? We want to update that notion and think about mental health, right? We know that depression is an issue that many people go through it, so we do want to incorporate other things. We wouldn't be fine with racial slur, right? With people using certain words that are forbidden in the sense that they are just not socially acceptable, isn't it? So these things are harmful. At least I think like that, right? I don't think about harm here like Mill, but I like to use a little bit broader, understanding of harm. That harm can be physical or psychological or moral, right? You can harm a person in different ways. And if you do think a little bit broader like that, then it's hard to have actions that are really happening in a vacuum like that, right? That they're isolated completely. So that's one of the critiques. The other critique you can make to Mill is, well, what if my freedom does not harm you, but it interferes with your freedom, right? Because he doesn't talk about that too much. But that I mean, the harm principle would also fail here. Uh, for example, I don't know, you were trying to drive your car, and I just block the road. Okay, so my freedom, I like, oh, I just want to park my car here in the middle of the road and block this road completely. It's my freedom. I want to do that, right? And but then it interferes with your freedom, obviously, because right, my liberty to stop my car there is means that you do not have your liberty to right to drive to get out of your trying to get out of your house and go to work, right? It's a dead end street. The only way you can get out is through that street, and your neighbor, blocked the street. So, I mean, there's no physical harm. You see the point, right? Here in this example of mine, there's no physical harm, but I mean, Stuart Mill, that's something that you want to think about as well, right? Um, or you're in a classroom and you want to ask questions. All of you want to ask questions, right? But if you ask a question and it takes you an hour to ask that question. I mean, you know how people go, oh, make more like a comment than a question and it will just last forever. You have the liberty, right, to ask a question. But if you ask a question that lasts half an hour, or if you keep asking questions all the time, then your freedom of asking questions means that your colleagues will not have the opportunity to ask questions because obviously that's up for your professor to say, wait, hold on and let me listen to other people. But when you go to seminars, and usually there's a Q&A at the end, there's very little time, and you see so there's probably going to be like 3 or 5 people. I mean, it depends on where you are, obviously. But when you go to the Q&A, there's usually much more people that want to ask questions that at some point you saw we have to wrap up and, sorry guys, but blah, blah, blah. If you think about those circumstances, right, there's always someone who's asking a question for 5 minutes or 6 minutes. It's not even a question. That person is just making a comment, trying to show off or whatever it is. And the person, that freedom of asking a question is actually taking away freedom from all the other people to ask questions that lose their opportunities. You see what I'm saying? So that's also right. It doesn't harm anyone, but I mean, in that the sense of physically hurting someone, right? But it interferes with someone. That's another critique. Okay. So last year, that was September last year, we had this just example to give an example of our city itself. We had this. I'm not sure what the status of this is right now. So if any of you go to Phoenix, you may or may not see this area here, where you had homeless people and it was declared illegal. I'm just bringing this example because here again, right? You could go back to Mill and ask the same. Let me just go down here a second so you can read while I speak if you want to. So I'm not sure if this is still, if people are living there or not, but here again, right, I'm just showing you this to ask the question, should the government declare this illegal or shouldn't it, right? And then go back to Stuart Mill and you can argue, well, so what they said is, well, people here, they're using drugs and no. So are they using drugs and just staying inside her tits? They can they obviously can walk around and do whatever they want. But the point is, the same to make the example of staying inside your house. In sense, are they using drugs and breaking windows, harming people, or are they just using drugs, right? Obviously, drugs are prohibited in public. I'm not discussing the law here. I'm just using Stuart Mill's example to discuss this, right? So here, what people said is that these guys and girls were harmful, not only in the sense that they were criminals or etc., right? But they were harmful to the businesses they were arguing, right? So people here were afraid. So people that would come and buy stuff from businesses were a bit afraid of walking around, etc. It was damaging businesses. Also, people who live in the area, they just find it, they find it harmful in a not physical way. You see what I'm saying? They walk around and they're like, I don't like seeing this, right? And we can debate, right? Do they have the right to feel like that or not? That's a different issue. I'm just saying that at the end of the day, this did happen. And if it was because they were actually harming other people, physically harming other people, then Milt would be okay with this ruling. Otherwise, if it's just because people feel uncomfortable, right? That's what I'm saying here. So people feel harmed. You can say, oh, people walk around and it harms them in the sense that they feel uncomfortable. But Stuart Mill say, I don't care if you feel uncomfortable. If you're not getting harmed, you shouldn't interfere with someone's liberty. You see, but just to give an example, another one would be from a few days ago, right? So that there's the abortion. Let me try to make this go away. It's so annoying. Okay. So yes, you've read this from a few days ago. The abortion law in in Arizona, which is older than the state itself, and which was passed before women could vote. So there you have an abortion law which was passed before women could vote, and it's now it passed, right, according to the Supreme Court of Arizona. The general attorney has said that he will not, that no one will go to jail because of the law, but the law is pretty strict on abortion. I guess you guys know about this, right? But yeah, essentially that you could go to jail if you do abortion, if you do abort your kid. So this law is from 1864, and it was, revived now to celebrate 160 years since its birth. But either way, here again, right, Stuart Mill, should we or shouldn't we prohibit abortion? Stuart Mill was saying, well, you're not harming. Well, depends, because I guess that's part of the discussion in abortions as well, which is so interesting. Because you could say, are you harming the baby or not, right? It depends on when does the baby become a person, right? When do you understand that a baby becomes a person, right? I'm saying this because coincidentally or not, my sister went to law school, and her master's dissertation was exactly about this. She was saying, in order to argue that she's a law student, but she actually ended up studying biology because she had to understand when, after you get pregnant, when is it that the baby develops the nervous system and starts feeling pain, even though you won't remember anything obviously when you grow up, but at some point you have, right, the nervous system is developed, and in theory a human being could feel pain at some point. So she was studying the development of the babies inside, from a biological perspective, to try to understand, is it the case that we can argue, well, abortions, right, like the day after pill, that's fine because the baby, isn't anything yet, essentially, at that point. My sister argued, at least in her thesis, after a week, right, you still don't have a nervous system, and then after 2 weeks or whatever it is, there's going to be a threshold. But that's just a curiosity that it's interesting if you think about Stuart Mill. In order to say you can or you cannot abort, right, it depends on whether you're harming the baby or not, and when the baby becomes a baby. Is it from day one, right? Is it from the moment of conception, or is it after a few weeks or days or hours, right? I have no answer to that, of course, but interesting to think about these issues of role of state versus liberty, especially now, right, where you have this thing that just happened. It's also interesting here that Republicans are more favorable to a law like this, which actually does coerce liberty, right? So remember the two concepts of liberty that I started class with? I said one is more similar to Republicans, they typically favor liberty, right? Whereas the other one, the more paternalistic one, is more associated to the Democrats. But that's not always the case, I mentioned. And here's an exception, right? Because in principle, if Republicans always defend that idea of Stuart Mill of the state doesn't shouldn't do anything, then in principle at least, they should be against, a law that bans abortions, unless they argue, like I did, that the baby, you're harming the baby, of course, right? If you are, well, since day one, the baby is already a person, and by the abortion would be a physical harm to another individual who has a right to live, and that's why we should restrict freedom, right? The freedom to abort, because to guarantee the freedom of the individual, that the baby that is still not even born, right? You could argue like that, I guess that would make sense, but it depends how you argue it, right? But if you don't use that explanation I just used, then you would find a counter example, isn't it, where the Democrat Party is more pro-liberty here in no sense, right? They're like individual choice. They respect the individual choice of the mother here, whereas the Republic doesn't respect the choice of the mother, but maybe they are arguing that they're respecting the choice of the baby that wasn't born. I don't know, and this is very polemical. So just so you think about these things that are very interesting as well. Okay, very last point I want to make is that Stuart Mill is obviously, if you've heard this distinction between negative freedom and positive freedom, that's quite useful here. And you could call negative freedom liberty and call positive freedom freedom. Okay, that would be, remember what I said earlier, one liberty. So let's say the liberty to do anything you want. So that's negative freedom, right? No one is preventing you. It's freedom from, no one prevents you from. Okay. Whereas the positive freedom is when the state not only does not prevent you from doing something, but it also helps you. It's more paternalistic in that second sense of the word. So Stuart Mill is a proponent of this vision here of negative freedom and liberty, right? Is that the state does not prevent you from doing stuff, right? This distinction is very interesting because this is part of the criticism that he receives sometimes, right? If you use that very narrow role, if you have that very narrow role for the state, only the negative freedom one or the liberty, then we can say, well, okay, fine. So I have the liberty to do whatever I want, but that causes other people to lose their freedom, right? If I'm just not prevented from, so not negative freedom here is you have the liberty. No one is prohibiting you from going anywhere. Okay. No one's the government or is not pointing a gun in your face and saying you cannot do this, you cannot do that. That's negative freedom or liberty, right? You can in principle do anything you want. All right. But at the end of the day, you may have the liberty but not have the freedom. All right. Because it's the car example. If we all have negative freedom, if we all have liberty, then my neighbor can get his car and just park it in the middle of the road. That's his liberty, right? No one's preventing him from not doing that. But that means that I don't have freedom, right? Because I simply cannot drive my car and I'm blocked at my house right now. You see? So Stuart Mill is more favorable to this idea of negative freedom of liberty, but another problem of that and criticism could be that oftentimes when you don't have laws and the police and regulation and etc., no one's preventing you from doing things, right? The government is not preventing you. You have theoretically the liberty and the freedom to do something, but in practice you don't really have the actual conditions of doing that thing, right? If the government doesn't prohibit people from drinking and driving, right, then you don't have the freedom to drive and enjoy your, have a good time driving around because there's a bunch of people driving around drunk and you feel so scared all the time that you can't even enjoy your time. So negative freedom would say no one is preventing you from not doing anything that would be compatible with people getting drunk and driving, whereas positive freedom, which assumes a little bit more of a role for the state, would mean enforcing certain things, right? That you are prohibited from doing something things so that all of us can have more freedom collectively. All right, that's the last distinction I wanted to make, and that's the end of part one. The part two and part three are going to be shorter than this, I assume. But that's about it. Thank you very much.